really and truly a very expensive drainage system, and it is an expensive operation no matter what way you come at it to a degree. If that's only going to be benefiting you 1 year in 10, then it's very hard to justify that cost. There isn't a field in Ireland that can't be drained if enough money is spent on it, but that doesn't justify doing it unless there's going to be a payback, which is the economic side of things.
Drainage on tillage ground is critical to aid or even allow sustainable production in our wetter climate. Having some knowledge of soils and subsoils on your farm is essential for a drainage system to adequately drain water in a normal year, but also in an abnormal year like this year. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. In this episode, the second of a two-part series, we pick up again with Pat Tuohy, a researcher in Teagasc dealing with soil hydrology and drainage, to talk about tackling ponding in the middle of fields and how the subsoil can have a huge bearing on the type of drainage system which should be used.
The first question is really, is the system that's installed appropriate? And it might be appropriate in a year like 2022 or a year like 9 out of 10 years or 7 out of 10 years, but a year like 2023 then will show it up as being below capacity for that kind of an extreme in terms of higher rainfalls. So a well-installed, well-designed drainage system will deal comfortably with rainfall of 12 to 15 millimeters a day, which in normal circumstances is well above the average of what we're getting. But a poorly designed or poorly maintained drainage system might be catering for 4 mil a day on average or 5 millimeters of rainfall a day on average, and that's fine, as I said, in a relatively dry year, but that's well under designed or undercooked in a year like we've been through. And as I said earlier, that's when the problems are highlighted. So it goes back, and maybe it's something we can get into in a moment, but it goes back to when I say is the system appropriate, I'm talking about, is the system suited to the soil type in question. So we generally look at the soil as being or an understanding of the deeper soil profile being the forerunner to designing a drainage system and making sure that where there is groundwater movement or deeper water movement, that is targeted, or that is the aim of the drainage system, to remove that groundwater, or where there's not groundwater movement, where there's issues with permeability throughout the soil profile, that we incorporate another approach in a shallow system and maybe tie it in with mold drainage or gravel mold drainage or subsoiling to some degree. So look, there's different approaches that could be taken, but the first question really is that leads into that really is whether the system is appropriate, or whether it's robust enough or maintained well enough to deal with the likes of the year we've had. And in a lot of cases, the answer is that it's undercooked or can be undercooked relative to the wet conditions we've been living through.
And as you say, it comes back to, I suppose for the most part, most tillage ground would be, have reasonable soil on the top, and it wouldn't be. There's very little kind of black kind of soils, I suppose, really, for the most part, like the fens in the UK would have very little of that. But it's really kind of what you're saying is it's whatever's underneath, whatever's probably below the plough pan or the plough layer, kind of what's down underneath there, and what I suppose permeability is down there is probably the key thing in terms of getting that away. Is there any kind of rule of thumbs for some of those types of, whether they're clays or near my own home at home, it's like grey marl, as my dad would have described it as, or is there other types that we should be getting more concerned about?
Yeah, and your first point is really valid, Michael. Like, we're not talking about the first 12 inches here, 18 inches. We're talking, when I talk about digging profile pits or test pits for drainage, we're talking 2.5 meters, 6 to 8 feet, and having a look to that depth to see what the issues are and see where, I suppose, really what it boils down to is where the water is being held up and where is it potentially moving. So yeah, like you've described, clays and grey marls there as common terms that would be very familiar to people, and the issues with those are if they're very heavy or very difficult soils, even in relatively small areas, if there's very little percolation of water down through the soil, then at all depths, and I'm talking about at all depths down to my 2.5 meter figures, 6 or 8 feet, then really you're talking about a shallow system. So when I talk about a shallow system, it's collector drains or field drains at a meter depth and crisscrossing those with gravel mold channels or a subsoiler, depending on the soil type and whether it'll take a mold channel or not, I suppose effectively is the bottom line on that one. Or the deeper systems, which again, if you're seeing free water movement or groundwater movement consistently throughout an area that you're thinking of draining, and be that at 5, 6, 7 feet, provided there's an outlet for that, it's a very productive way of draining the land, because the water is naturally able to move to your drain, and that's obviously a very good way of allowing for collection of that water. If the water can move freely and can be discharged, then you're discharging a huge volume of water. You're lowering the water table as a result, and you're allowing for more capacity when the next rainfall event happens. So there's different methods that are suited to different soil types.
I have seen, I suppose, in the past where there might be a tendency with larger machines, as there is in maybe tillage as well, where you have a relatively big Hymac, 30-ton Hymac. You can go to any depth you like, and there's maybe a tendency to maybe overdig, maybe go too deep in soils that aren't necessarily suited to that kind of method.
Yeah, and that's the real, I suppose, problem with drainage works in general is not having the most suitable method in play. So you're either, as you're suggesting there, in a site that isn't gaining anything out of overly deep drains, you're spending an awful lot of money to go deeper. Or a more common issue, really, to be honest, from what I'm seeing, is drains that should be a bit deeper and would be able to pick up groundwater movement if they were appropriately installed at a suitable depth, but they're too shallow and they're not hitting that kind of that level that they should be at in terms of discharging that groundwater. So it's matching the soil profile to the drainage type. Look, in terms of our conversation today, I suppose, but we can only cover so much. There is a drainage manual out there that was updated only last year, Michael. It's freely available on the Teagasc website. It's called the Teagasc Drainage Manual, Manual on Drainage and Soil Management. And hard copies of that can be purchased as well through the website. So that will go into a lot more detail than we've time to cover today. But again, it's highlighting those issues, establishing what the issues are in terms of soil type and in terms of potential drainage depth, and then going about installing drains to suit that particular problem is really what it boils down to.
Can I ask you the other one, I suppose, which is kind of drainage, but it's not drainage in traditional sense, I suppose. Mold drain, you mentioned there a few minutes ago. It's very common, I suppose, in terms of what you would read in the UK. In lots of different places, they seem to be very keen on doing it. Is that a practice that is practiced much in Ireland, or is it even suitable in Ireland, or is there parts of the country where it's more suitable than others, perhaps?
Yeah, so it boils down to soil type. For a mold drain, so a mold plough will install a channel, which is an unlined channel, so there's nothing supporting that channel. What's holding that channel open is the heaviness of the soil, that real sticky, tacky, high clay content soil is what it's suited to. So you need a stone-free soil and you need a very high clay content. So there is a certain set of soils that in Ireland that it will suit. But they're not overly widespread in truth. And the effect of that really is that, if the soil isn't suited and if it's prone to collapsing, if it won't hold that channel open, you will have a system that's, by the time you go in that evening after finishing the operation, the channels might be half of them closed, and within a month they'll all be closed. Whereas in a soil that's suited, that's, suitably heavy and stone free, that channel will last, 3, 4, maybe even 5, 6 years, at which point it has to be repeated, but it's relatively cheap to repeat. You're crisscrossing the collector drains, which are the main arteries, we'll call them, or the more expensive part of the system. But the actual mold plough being pulled between those or crisscrossing those is relatively cheap in the right soil. Without that, then, so as I said, there's another cohort of soils that won't hold that, or that the channel won't survive in any meaningful time period, and then you're into gravel molding territory where you're filling that channel with gravel, which is a much more expensive way of doing things, obviously, because the material itself is expensive, but it's a much longer term and more intensive system, because you end up with very closely spaced drains that are maintained, because the gravel holds them open and the gravel provides for water movement. So that's the alternative.
Okay, probably very expensive for an agriculture scenario. You'd see a lot of that on sports fields, all right, but
yeah, exactly. It's one of those ones.
It'd be expensive for a tillage man, I would imagine. Two last questions for you, Pat. One, I suppose, is that, and you mentioned ordinarily relatively dry fields and they have a bit of drainage in it, and you mentioned that in ordinary circumstances, the drains can cope with the amount of rain that you would have of a normal year, but when you get abnormal amounts of rain, they're not necessarily able to cope. So I suppose there's two small questions in it. One is that, should a farmer just be a little bit more patient in terms of not pulling the pin, in terms of, geez, I better go out and do more drainage on that, and just say it's just exceptional year. It's going to come once every, hopefully not too often, but once every 10 years or so, and they're just going to have to put up with it. Or two, is there a scenario where there's an opportunity maybe to find maybe springs that come up in fields that weren't there in the past, that could be a problem occasionally, and now's the time maybe to go after them?
Yeah, so there's two issues there, and you mentioned it in relation to costs, I suppose. First of all, like, really and truly, and a very expensive drainage system, and it is an expensive operation, no matter what way you come at it, to a degree. If that's only going to be benefiting you 1 year in 10, then it's very hard to justify that cost. There isn't a field in Ireland that can't be drained if enough money is spent on it, but that doesn't justify doing it unless there's going to be a payback, which is the economic side of things. So there's certainly a point in your argument. Maybe it's worth waiting and seeing, and if this is an issue that has cropped up in 2023 that resolves itself in a normal year, then fine. It's maybe not justifiable to spend a whole lot of money on. If it's an issue that has cropped up in 2023 and lingers for the next couple of years, then it would pay, obviously, to try and resolve that with some kind of intervention based around drainage. And in terms of springs, look, again, that's related very much to the year in question, or a year like this where you get a lot more water around the place, and again, the listeners will be familiar. There's generally issues around springs in some parts of the land that crop up over winter but disappear at the height of the year because the water table is lower and there isn't a source of that water. But in a year like this, it kind of carries on for longer because there's more water around. Springs are difficult to look. It's a very site-specific issue. You may be it's all about getting depth into the drain and getting under the spring, or allowing the spring to find its way out of the site, to find an easier exit out of the site. But they can be difficult to trace down, in that a job of work can be done to try and divert a spring, and a year or two later it will have moved or found its way up somewhere else adjacent to that drain. So it's just something that it's very hard to comment on generally. It's just something that needs a bit of investigation on each case, and to try and see, I suppose, first of all, is it a very wet year problem that we can survive most years? If it's something that's there in the longer term, then can we look at where it's coming from, and providing an outlet across a slope that will divert the spring water away, and not allow it to move away from that drain or from that work over time. So there's a couple of different issues there, which are, as I said, maybe hard to talk about generally.
The final question I want to ask you, and I suppose, is the fact that maybe maps on lots of farms aren't as good as they could be. And I know certainly here in Oak Park, there was a number of drainage issues that became apparent over time, but I think they had to go back digging for maps from the 18-something others to get some of these, box shores and bits and pieces that were there, and not every farm would necessarily have that either, especially where I suppose there's larger culverts going across their land from one farm out to a river, across to maybe two other holdings, I feel like. I just wonder, is there any new technology, Pat, that's out there that might be able to help scanning, or I'm not sure. I mean, we can often see it on a very dry year where you can see drains maybe more clearly. But is there any new technology available or coming, or maybe that you've investigated that might be able to help farmers in a tricky situation like that?
Yeah, and it's a question we've been asking ourselves. I suppose there's a wider issue around the policy nationally around drainage. So from our point of view, we've been looking at this in terms of can we map what's out there at times, or can we look at that question in terms of without having all the information to hand, what can we find out, after the fact. So look, there's various different methods that are being developed or have been developed over the years. We've used ourselves electrical resistivity, for example, ground penetrating radar, for different purposes, for classifying soils, maybe more so, but showing up, you can see in some of those cases, certainly, remnants of where field drains were dug. What the system is picking up is probably more the disturbance caused by the digging of the drains as opposed to what's left in the ground, so to speak. But there are ways and means. There isn't a whole lot, I suppose, in the short term, I suppose, practical stuff that could be applied at farm scale, but I think it's something that's probably coming down the tracks in terms of, as I said, trying to figure out that question of what went where after the fact without an actual source of information on what was installed.
Okay. So not particularly at the moment, but hopefully in time is kind of what you're saying. I'm taking from you.
Yeah, exactly, Michael. Yeah.
Brilliant. Listen, I suppose just to remind people again, as you mentioned earlier, that manual of drainage. What do we call it? The Teagasc Manual for Drainage, is that what it's called?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's on the Teagasc website, teagasc.ie. So if you just Google teagasc.ie and drainage together, it'll come up fairly fast, I think, for you. So Pat, listen, thanks very much. Delighted to have you on the show, and we might have you back again because I think we were only after touching the surface in terms of some of the other bits and pieces that might be of interest to tillage farmers, because I have a feeling, even though cash flow isn't wonderful just at the minute, but I have a feeling a lot of farmers are looking at a bit of ground and thinking, I'm going to have to spend some money in that to get some crops out at in future. So Pat, thanks again.
No problem, Michael.
So that's it for this week, and a huge thanks to Pat for joining me on the show. Don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.